When my husband said the house was in his name, it wasn't in an argument or a courtroom. It was in a hushed voice standing beside my mother's casket. I didn't hear it at first. Grief has a way of muffling the world, like cotton pressed into your ears. The chapel smelled of lilies and furniture polish, the kind that stings the back of your throat. Someone was crying softly near the front, my aunt, I think, and the organ hummed a low, patient note as if it knew we weren't ready to let go. I stood there with my hands folded too tightly, knuckles pale, staring at the line of carnations arranged just so, each petal perfect, each one wrong because my mother was gone. It was the murmur that reached me, a half sentence drifting over the carpet. My husband's voice, calm, certain. "The house is in my name anyway," he said, as if he were explaining something simple. "She doesn't need to worry." I turned my head slowly, the way you do when you're afraid of what you might see if you move too fast. He was standing with my cousin Mark near the side wall, their black suits pressed and tidy. My husband's hand rested lightly on Mark's shoulder, a comforting gesture. He wore that same careful expression he used when he talked about finances or repairs, measured, reasonable, unbothered. I waited for the rest of the sentence to make sense of the part that didn't. Maybe he meant something else. Maybe I misheard. The organ hummed again. Someone cleared their throat. My husband caught my eye then, just for a second, and offered me a small nod, the kind that says, "I'm here. You're not alone." But the words were already lodged in me, sharp as a bone. After the service, there were casseroles and condolences, hugs that lingered too long and others that barely touched. My mother's friends told me stories I'd heard 100 times, how she stayed up late sewing my Halloween costume, how she never missed a birthday. I smiled and thanked them and felt like I was watching myself from a distance, nodding at the right places, my body moving on its own. Our house had always been the gathering place. It was modest, 2 stories, creaky stairs, a narrow kitchen that smelled perpetually of coffee and dish soap, but it held us. It held my mother's laugh when she visited, the clatter of her teacup against the saucer, the way she'd sit at the small dining table and tell me, "Don't forget who you are, no matter how busy life gets." That house was where my husband and I started our life together. We met in our late 20s, both of us already a little tired of the world. He was steady, dependable. He paid his bills on time, remembered anniversaries, fixed leaky faucets without being asked. When he asked me to marry him, it felt less like fireworks and more like settling into a warm chair after a long day. Safety can feel like love when you've been standing too long. We bought the house 5 years into our marriage. I remember the day we got the keys, how he swung them once in the air like a prize, how I laughed and told him to stop showing off. The realtor shook our hands and said, "Congratulations to both of us." We signed papers side by side at a polished table that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. My name was on the documents. I remember that clearly because my mother made a point of asking. "You made sure it's both of you, right?" she said later when we celebrated with takeout on the living room floor. "Yes, Mama," I told her, rolling my eyes. "I'm not fool." She smiled, satisfied, and passed me a napkin. Life settled into its routines after that. I worked at the clinic downtown, long hours that left my feet aching. My husband handled the bills and the yard. On Sundays, we grocery shopped together, arguing lightly over brands and coupons. In the evenings, we sat on the couch, our shoulders touching, watching reruns we'd already seen. It wasn't passionate, but it was peaceful. Or so I thought. My mother fell ill quietly, the way strong women often do. She brushed off the early signs, insisted she was fine, told me not to fuss. By the time she agreed to see a doctor, the word terminal hung in the air like a verdict no one wanted to read aloud. I moved into a state of suspended urgency, appointments, medications, late-night phone calls. Grief began before death ever arrived. My husband was supportive in his way. He drove me to the hospital when I was too tired to trust myself behind the wheel. He made soup and set it on the stove, texted to ask if I'd eaten. But there was a distance I couldn't name, like a door he kept half closed. When I talked about my mother, he listened, nodded, but his eyes drifted, calculating something I couldn't see. The day my mother died, the house felt wrong, too quiet. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at a chip in the wood, tracing it with my finger over and over until my husband came in and placed a hand on my back. "I'm here," he said. I believed him. In the weeks that followed, arrangements took over. There were forms and phone calls and decisions that felt impossible to make. Flowers, hymns, who would speak. My husband handled what he said he would. He contacted the funeral home, coordinated with my cousin. I was grateful. I didn't have the strength to question anything. Until the chapel, until that sentence slipped out of his mouth like it belonged there. After the service, back at the house, people filled the rooms with noise. Plates clinked. Someone turned on a lamp. I drifted from room to room, accepting embraces, offering tea, my heart bruised and heavy. At one point, I found myself in the doorway of our bedroom, looking at the dresser where my mother's scarf lay folded, a bright blue thing she'd forgotten the last time she visited. My husband appeared beside me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I heard what you said," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He frowned slightly. "What did I say?" "At the chapel," I said, "about the house." There was a pause, brief but telling. He smoothed his tie, a nervous habit I'd seen 100 times. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said. "Just paperwork. Don't worry about it now." Not now, not today. The phrase settled over me like a blanket meant to smother questions. I wanted to let it go. I wanted to crawl into bed and sleep for a week and wake up to a world where my mother was still alive and my marriage was what I believed it to be. Instead, I stood there holding that blue scarf and felt something shift inside me, quietly, irrevocably. I said, "Okay." At night, after everyone left and the house finally fell silent, I lay awake listening to the tick of the clock in the hallway. My husband's breathing was steady beside me. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering over the pavement. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the words again and again. "The house is in my name." I didn't know it yet, but that sentence was the first crack in a foundation I thought was solid. And cracks, once they start, have a way of spreading. The morning after the funeral, I woke before the sun. Grief does that. It pulls you out of sleep as if there's something urgent you're forgetting, and for a few seconds before the weight settles back onto your chest, you almost feel normal. Almost. The house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, like it didn't recognize me anymore. I padded into the kitchen barefoot, the tile cold against my soles, and put the kettle on. My mother used to say tea tasted better when the house was still half asleep. I poured the water too soon and it came out lukewarm, weak. I drank it anyway. My husband came in later, freshly showered, his hair neatly combed. He kissed my cheek and asked if I wanted eggs. His voice was gentle, considerate. If someone had been watching us from the outside, they would have seen a caring husband tending to his grieving wife. "Do you have to go in today?" I asked. He hesitated, just a fraction. "For a bit," he said. "I'll be back early." I nodded. We were both good at nodding. After he left, I wandered through the house with no real purpose. I picked up empty cups, folded a blanket someone had left draped over the chair. In the living room, sunlight fell across the bookshelf where our photo albums sat in uneven stacks. I pulled one down and opened it on the couch. There we were, younger, smiling too hard at the camera. There was the picture from the day we moved in, me standing on the porch, keys in my hand, my husband behind me with his arm around my waist. I remembered how proud we'd been, how my mother insisted on taking that photo, saying, "This is a milestone, you'll want to remember this." I traced my finger over the image, a strange unease curling in my stomach. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief makes you suspicious, my mother used to say. It makes shadows where there are none. So when the thought returned about what my husband had said at the funeral, I pushed it aside. He'd been talking to Mark, who worried about everything. Maybe it was shorthand. Maybe he meant he handled the payments. Maybe. Still, that afternoon, I found myself sitting at the desk in the spare room, pulling out the old file folder where we kept important documents, mortgage statements, insurance papers, warranties for appliances we no longer owned. I flipped through them slowly, my hands steady, my heart not. The deed wasn't there. I frowned and checked again, more carefully this time, sliding each paper aside, even opening envelopes that had already been emptied. Nothing. I told myself we might have moved it, that it could be in the safe or the filing cabinet in the garage. I stood up, a little too quickly, and felt lightheaded. "Stop," I murmured to myself, "not today." I closed the folder and put it back where it belonged. The days that followed blurred together. Thank you cards, leftover food, phone calls from relatives checking in. I returned to work sooner than anyone expected, grateful for the routine. At the clinic, I could focus on charts and schedules, on other people's problems. My coworkers spoke to me softly, asked how I was doing. I smiled and said, one day at a time, because that's what you say when you don't have the words for the truth. At home, my husband carried on as usual. He cooked dinner, asked about my day, reminded me to take my coat when it got cold. But there were small things, changes so minor I might have missed them if I hadn't already been listening too closely. He started taking phone calls in the other room. When mail arrived, he sorted through it quickly, stacking it neatly before I could glance at the envelopes. Once, when I asked if he'd seen a letter from the bank, he said no without looking up, his answer too quick. "You okay?" he asked me one evening as I stood at the sink, staring at the window above it. "Just tired," I said. He nodded, satisfied. The first real clue came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my mother's favorite day to call. She liked to joke that the week hadn't worn her down yet. I'd come home early from work with a headache and found a man standing on our porch, clipboard in hand. "Can I help you?" I asked. He glanced up, polite. "I'm here about the inspection," he said. "Inspection?" I repeated. He checked the address. "Yes, ma'am, routine assessment." I shook my head. We didn't schedule anything. He hesitated. "I spoke with the homeowner earlier this week," he said. He confirmed. The word homeowner echoed in my ears. "My husband?" I asked. "Yes." I thanked him and told him there must be a mistake, that I'd need to reschedule. He left without argument, but as I closed the door, my hands were shaking. That evening, when my husband came home, I asked him about it. I tried to keep my tone light, curious rather than accusing. "Oh, that," he said, loosening his tie. "Just something I'm looking into, nothing for you to worry about." "What kind of inspection?" I asked. He smiled, the corners of his mouth tight. "It's boring, trust me." Trust me. The words sat between us like an offering and a warning all at once. I wanted to push, to demand answers, but something in his posture, closed, controlled, stopped me. Instead, I nodded and turned back to the stove, my appetite gone. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, watching me with that look she used to give when she knew something I didn't. When I tried to ask her what was wrong, my voice wouldn't work. I woke with my heart racing. The next day, during my lunch break, I did something I'd never done before. I called the county records office. "Hi," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my fingers. "I'm calling to confirm property ownership." The woman on the other end asked for the address. I gave it to her, each number deliberate. "One moment," she said. I stared at the wall, listening to the faint hum of office noise through the receiver. My mother's voice drifted through my memory. "Don't ignore that feeling. It's there for a reason." "Okay," she said. "I have it here." "Yes?" I prompted. "The property is currently listed under your husband's name only. The transfer was recorded 6 months ago." 6 months. I thanked her and hung up, my hand numb around the phone. The room felt too bright, the air too thin.
6 months ago, my mother had still been alive. I still believed my marriage was shared ground. I sat there until my break was over, my mind replaying moments I hadn't questioned at the time. His late nights, the papers he signed without comment, the way he'd insisted on handling things when my mother first got sick. That evening, I didn't confront him, not yet. I needed to understand how. I needed to know why. And somewhere beneath the fear and hurt, something else began to take shape. A quiet resolve, steady and unyielding. I wasn't finished listening, and I wasn't finished standing in my own house, pretending it wasn't mine.
I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay still beside my husband, listening to the soft rattle of his breath, the familiar rhythm that used to comfort me. Now it only reminded me how long he'd been breathing easily while I was walking around in the dark. 6 months. I repeated it in my head the way you worry a loose thread, pulling at it until everything else starts to come apart. 6 months ago, my mother was already sick, already leaning on me in ways I hadn't even recognized yet. 6 months ago, I trusted my husband enough to let him handle paperwork I should have insisted on seeing myself. In the quiet of the early morning, I got out of bed and went to the spare room, closing the door softly behind me. The desk lamp cast a small, yellow circle of light. I opened my laptop and began to search. At first, I didn't know what I was looking for, only that the truth had left fingerprints somewhere. I pulled bank statements, scrolling through deposits and withdrawals with new eyes. There it was, a series of small fees, months apart, all labeled vaguely. Administrative costs, filing services, things I'd skimmed over without a second thought. My hands were steady now, too steady. I checked our email next, the shared account we'd set up years ago. Most of the messages were routine, bills, ads, reminders, but when I searched by date, I found gaps, conversations deleted, threads missing. That absence felt louder than any proof. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, I'd made a list, dates, amounts, names I didn't recognize. I closed the laptop and sat back, rubbing my temples. I felt older than I had the day before, as if knowledge itself had weight. My husband woke later, yawning, stretching. He found me in the kitchen already dressed for work, though it was my day off. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. He poured himself coffee and took a sip. "You should try to rest today." I watched him over the rim of my mug. "I called the county yesterday," I said quietly. The cup froze halfway to his mouth. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice even but his eyes sharp. "To understand what you meant at the funeral." He set the mug down carefully, too carefully. "This really isn't the time," he said. "You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly." "I am thinking clearly," I said. "The house is in your name. You transferred it 6 months ago." Silence settled between us, thick and heavy. The refrigerator clicked on. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. He exhaled slowly and ran a hand over his face. "He did what I had to do," he said. "For who?" I asked. "For us," he replied. "You were distracted. Your mother was sick. Someone had to make decisions." "You took my name off the deed," I said, "without telling me." "It was a formality," he said, his tone slipping into that patient cadence he used when explaining things he thought I couldn't grasp. "You're still my wife. Nothing changes." "Everything changes," I thought. "Why?" I asked. "Just tell me why." He hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something flicker, fear maybe, or annoyance at being questioned. "Because it made things simpler. For refinancing, for liability, you wouldn't have understood the details." The words landed like slaps, one after the other. I thought of my mother, of her sharp mind, of the way she'd balanced budgets on scrap paper, questioned every charge.
You decided I wouldn't understand, I said. You decided not to burden me, he corrected. I laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised us both. I didn't burden you, I said. You erased me. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. That was the moment something hardened in me. Grief had softened me, worn down my edges, but now I felt myself pull inward, gather what was left of my strength. I want to see the paperwork, I said. There's nothing to see, he replied. It's done. Then undo it, I said. He shook his head. It's not that simple. No, it never is. He left for work shortly after, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood in the kitchen long after his car was gone, my reflection staring back at me from the dark window. I barely recognized the woman looking back. Older, yes, but clearer somehow. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Her office was small and smelled faintly of coffee and old books. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, from the funeral to the phone call, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. What he did may not be legal, she said when I finished, especially if you didn't consent. I felt a rush of something like relief, tempered by anger. What do I do? I asked. We gather evidence and we take our time. Time, another thing my husband decided I didn't need. Over the next few weeks, I moved carefully, quietly. I copied documents, forwarded emails, took photos of statements. I asked questions at the bank, at the clinic, anywhere my husband's shadow might have stretched without me noticing. Each answer filled in another piece of the picture. He'd been planning something, a loan, a sale. I didn't know which yet, but the inspection, the refinancing, it all pointed to a future he imagined without me. At home, I played my part. I nodded, I listened, I cooked dinner and asked about his day. He seemed to relax, mistaking my silence for surrender. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a calculating look, as if measuring how much I knew. One evening, he mentioned a family gathering his brother was hosting. It'd be good for you to get out. I smiled and agreed, already knowing what I would do. Because secrets once uncovered have a way of demanding daylight, and I was done carrying his alone.
I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay still beside my husband, listening to the soft rattle of his breath, the familiar rhythm that used to comfort me. Now it only reminded me how long he'd been breathing easily while I was walking around in the dark. 6 months. I repeated it in my head the way you worry a loose thread, pulling at it until everything else starts to come apart. 6 months ago, my mother was already sick, already leaning on me in ways I hadn't even recognized yet. 6 months ago, I trusted my husband enough to let him handle paperwork I should have insisted on seeing myself. In the quiet of the early morning, I got out of bed and went to the spare room, closing the door softly behind me. The desk lamp cast a small yellow circle of light. I opened my laptop and began to search. At first, I didn't know what I was looking for, only that the truth had left fingerprints somewhere. I pulled bank statements, scrolling through deposits and withdrawals with new eyes. There it was, a series of small fees, months apart, all labeled vaguely. Administrative costs, filing services, things I'd skimmed over without a second thought. My hands were steady now, too steady. I checked our email next, the shared account we'd set up years ago. Most of the messages were routine, bills, ads, reminders, but when I searched by date, I found gaps. Conversations deleted, threads missing. That absence felt louder than any proof. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, I'd made a list. Dates, amounts, names I didn't recognize. I closed the laptop and sat back, rubbing my temples.
I felt older than the day before, as if knowledge itself had weight. My husband woke later, yawning, stretching. He found me in the kitchen, already dressed for work, though it was my day off. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. He poured himself coffee and took a sip. "You should try to rest today." I watched him over the rim of my mug. "I called the county yesterday," I said quietly. The cup froze halfway to his mouth. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice even but his eyes sharp. "To understand what you meant at the funeral." He set the mug down carefully, too carefully. "This really isn't the time," he said. "You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly." "I am thinking clearly," I said. "The house is in your name. You transferred it 6 months ago." Silence settled between us, thick and heavy. The refrigerator clicked on. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. He exhaled slowly and ran a hand over his face. "He did what I had to do," he said. "For who?" I asked. "For us," he replied. "You were distracted, your mother was sick, someone had to make decisions." "You took my name off the deed," I said, "without telling me." "It was a formality," he said, his tone slipping into that patient cadence he used when explaining things he thought I couldn't grasp. "You're still my wife. Nothing changes." "Everything changes," I thought. "Why?" I asked. "Just tell me why." He hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something flicker, fear maybe, or annoyance at being questioned. "Because it made things simpler," he said. "For refinancing, for liability, you wouldn't have understood the details." The words landed like slaps, one after the other. I thought of my mother, of her sharp mind, of the way she'd balanced budgets on scrap paper, questioned every charge. "You decided I wouldn't understand," I said. "You decided not to burden me," he corrected. I laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised us both. "I didn't burden you," I said. "You erased me." His jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." That was the moment something hardened in me. Grief had softened me, worn down my edges, but now I felt myself pull inward, gather what was left of my strength. "I want to see the paperwork," I said. "There's nothing to see," he replied. "It's done." "Then undo it," I said. He shook his head. "It's not that simple." "No," I agreed. "It never is." He left for work shortly after, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood in the kitchen long after his car was gone, my reflection staring back at me from the dark window. I barely recognized the woman looking back. Older, yes, but clearer somehow. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Her office was small and smelled faintly of coffee and old books. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, from the funeral to the phone call, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. "What he did may not be legal," she said when I finished. I felt a rush of something like relief, tempered by anger. "What do I do?" She said, "We gather evidence and we take our time." Time, another thing my husband had decided I didn't need. Over the next few weeks, I moved carefully, quietly. I copied documents, forwarded emails, took photos of statements. I asked questions at the bank, at the clinic, anywhere my husband's shadow might have stretched without me noticing. Each answer filled in another piece of the picture. He'd been planning something, a loan, a sale, I didn't know which yet, but the inspection, the refinancing, it all pointed to a future he'd imagined without me. At home, I played my part. I nodded, I listened, I cooked dinner and asked about his day. He seemed to relax, mistaking my silence for surrender. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a calculating look, as if measuring how much I knew. One evening, he mentioned a family gathering his brother was hosting. "It'd be good for you to get out." I smiled and agreed. already knowing what I would do, because secrets, once uncovered, have a way of demanding daylight, and I was done carrying his alone.
The house was too quiet once my husband moved out. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that presses in on you, makes every sound feel louder than it should. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the stairs settling at night, the tick of that same hallway clock, still faithful, still counting time whether I was ready or not. He packed his things on a Thursday while I was at work. I'd asked him to, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I couldn't watch him fold his shirts into boxes, couldn't stand the idea of him deciding one last time what belonged to him. When I came home, half the closet was empty. His shoes were gone from the mat by the door. The spare key sat on the kitchen counter, right where I'd asked him to leave it. I picked it up and turned it over in my palm. Such a small thing to hold so much weight. That night, I cooked dinner for one. I stood at the stove and realized how long it had been since I'd chosen a meal without considering his preferences. I added more garlic than he liked. I ate slowly at the table, not the couch, and noticed how the chair across from me stayed empty without accusing me of it. In the weeks that followed, the legal matters continued: paperwork, meetings, quiet conversations with my lawyer. But something else was happening alongside it, something less official and more fragile. I was learning how to listen to myself again. At first, it was small things. I rearranged the living room, moving the couch closer to the window because I liked the light there in the afternoon. I donated old clothes that no longer felt like mine. I started taking evening walks, letting the cool air settle my thoughts. People asked how I was doing. I told them the truth, or at least the version of it I could manage. "I'm figuring things out," I said. Some days were harder than others. Grief doesn't move in straight lines. It circles back when you least expect it. I'd be folding laundry and suddenly remember my mother's hands smoothing fabric the same way. I'd hear a song on the radio and have to pull over because the ache came too fast. One afternoon, I visited her grave alone. The ground was still fresh, the headstone newly placed. I knelt there, brushing away a fallen leaf, and spoke out loud. "You were right," I told her, about all of it. The words didn't feel foolish, they felt necessary. The final court hearing came quietly, without drama. The settlement was fair. The house remained ours in name, but in practice, it became mine. My husband didn't fight it. By then, the fight had drained out of both of us, leaving only a tired understanding. We met one last time to sign papers. He looked older, thinner somehow. He avoided my eyes at first, then finally met them. "You didn't think I'd notice," he said, not as an excuse, but as a confession. I studied him for a moment. "That's the part I can't forgive," I said gently. "Not what you did, but what you assumed about me." He nodded, as if he'd been expecting that answer. We signed, we stood, we walked away in separate directions. At home, I opened the windows and let fresh air move through the rooms. I washed the curtains, vacuumed the carpets, as if clearing space not just physically, but emotionally. I placed my mother's photo on the mantel, surrounded by small things that mattered: letters, a pressed flower, a chipped teacup she'd loved. Friends came by more often now. They brought laughter and noise and stories. My cousin helped me plant herbs in the backyard. My neighbor stopped in with soup and stayed to talk longer than either of us planned. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, I realized something. I wasn't bracing anymore. The house no longer felt like something that could be taken from me at any moment. It felt like shelter again, like a place that held my history without threatening my future. I sat on the front porch with a cup of tea, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood: cars passing, someone calling a dog inside, a screen door slamming down the block. Ordinary life moving forward. I thought about the woman I'd been standing beside my mother's casket, confused, grieving, unaware that her foundation had already been cracked.
I wanted to reach back through time and tell her this: you will stand, you will learn, you will not disappear. The pain didn't vanish, it softened, it settled into something that no longer defined me. Because what my husband never understood was this: the house was never just wood and walls. It was memory, it was effort, it was presence, and I had been present all along. Would you like me to write the closing audience reflection?
There's a certain kind of quiet that comes after everything loud has already happened. Not the stunned silence of shock, and not the hollow quiet of loss, but the steady, breathing quiet that settles in once you've stopped running from the truth. That's the quiet I found myself living in, weeks after the papers were signed, after my husband's name was no longer the only one attached to decisions that shaped my life. Mornings became gentler. I woke without that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that used to tighten before my eyes even opened. I brewed my coffee slowly now, standing by the kitchen window, watching the light shift across the backyard. The rosemary plant we'd planted had started to take hold, its scent sharp and grounding when I brushed past it. I started talking to the house, not in a lonely way, more like a conversation with an old friend who'd been waiting patiently for me to catch up. "I'm here," I'd say sometimes, touching the doorframe as I passed. I didn't go anywhere. It sounds small, I know, but after spending so long feeling like something fundamental could be taken from you without warning, those small reassurances mattered. Friends noticed the change before I did. "You look lighter," my cousin said one afternoon as we sat at the dining table, sorting through a box of old photos. "Still sad, but steadier." I smiled at that. I feel steadier. We laughed at pictures from years ago, bad haircuts, awkward poses, moments frozen in time before we knew how complicated life could become. When we found one of my mother holding me on the porch of this very house, my throat tightened, but I didn't look away. "I wish she were here to see you now," my cousin said softly. "She is," I replied, surprising myself with how sure I sounded. Not long after that, I ran into my husband unexpectedly at the grocery store. It was the kind of coincidence you think only happens in movies, but there he was, standing in the produce aisle, staring at a shelf of canned beans like they might explain something to him. We froze when we saw each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The past flickered between us, years compressed into a single breath. "You look well," he said finally. "So do you," I replied, because it was easier than saying everything else. He nodded, shifted his weight. "I'm renting now," he added, as if offering proof of something. "Smaller place." "I hope it feels like home," I said. He looked at me then, really looked. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said. I considered that. The impulse to soften, to comfort, rose up out of old habit, but I let it pass. "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't undo impact." He absorbed that quietly. We exchanged polite goodbyes and walked in opposite directions, our carts rolling away from each other down separate aisles. As I drove home, I realized something else had shifted. I no longer needed him to understand. Healing came in layers after that. Some days were clear and easy, others felt heavy without warning. But I learned to sit with the discomfort instead of pushing it away. I learned that strength doesn't always announce itself. It often shows up as patience, as boundaries, as the courage to say no without explaining yourself. I joined a grief support group at the community center, not because I thought I needed fixing, but because I wanted to listen. There were stories there of loss, of betrayal, of resilience that reminded me how many ways there are to survive. One woman fed something one evening that stayed with me. "I thought being strong meant never letting anything fall apart," she said. "Turns out it means letting it fall and choosing what to rebuild." That night I went home and wrote my mother a letter,
I told her about the house, about the court, about the moment I finally spoke up in front of his family. I told her I missed her voice, her advice, her steady presence. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. The house held all of it, the grief, the anger, the quiet triumphs. It didn't judge, it didn't rush me. It simply stood, solid and patient, reminding me that ownership isn't just legal, it's emotional. It's the knowledge that you belong somewhere because you've invested your life there. On the anniversary of my mother's passing, I invited a few people over. Nothing formal, just food, stories, shared memories. We lit candles as the sun went down, the soft glow filling the living room. Someone played music quietly in the background. I stood there, watching the room breathe with warmth, and felt something close to peace. Later, after everyone left, I sat alone on the couch, the candles burning low. I thought about that moment in the chapel, the way a single sentence had cracked open a truth I wasn't ready to face, but needed to face. My husband thought the house was in his name. What he didn't realize was that I had been carrying it all along. Every meal cooked, every floor scrubbed, every night spent worrying, loving, staying. My name was written into those walls long before any paperwork tried to erase it. And here's what I learned in the end. Grief will strip you down to your most vulnerable self. Some people will protect that vulnerability. Others will try to use it. Pay attention to who does which. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been told, directly or quietly, that you don't fully belong where you've given everything, please hear this. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to stand your ground even when your voice shakes. So I'll ask you what my mother would have asked me if she were sitting here now. If someone tried to take your place in your own life, would you stay silent or would you speak? I'd love to know what you would have done. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about truth, dignity, and finding your footing again, then stay with me. There are more to tell. In the months that followed, I learned something I hadn't expected. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with announcements or dramatic turning points. It shows up quietly, in ordinary moments. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss it altogether. Like the first time I realized I hadn't checked my phone all evening, waiting for a message that wouldn't come. Or the morning I reached for my coat and didn't feel that familiar flicker of anxiety. What mood will he be in today? Those moments didn't feel like victory. They felt like space. I began to reclaim parts of myself I hadn't known I'd misplaced. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. My hands were clumsy at first, clay slipping through my fingers, collapsing under too much pressure. The instructor laughed kindly and said, "You're holding on too tight." That stayed with me. I stopped apologizing for things that didn't require apology. I stopped explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. When relatives asked careful, uncomfortable questions about my marriage, I answered simply, "It ended," I'd say, "and I'm okay." And I was. Not every day, not in every moment, but in the way that mattered most. One evening, as I sorted through old mail, I found a folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside were documents from the early days of my marriage, our first lease, our joint bank account forms, handwritten notes we'd passed back and forth when we were still learning how to be careful with each other. I sat on the floor and read them slowly. There was love there, real love, and acknowledging that didn't weaken me, it strengthened me, because it reminded me that I hadn't imagined the foundation. It had been real. It had simply been changed without my consent. That distinction mattered. I thought often about the moment at my mother's funeral, how vulnerable I'd been standing there, wrapped in grief, unaware that someone I trusted had already shifted the ground beneath my feet. That memory used to fill me with anger. Now it filled me with clarity. Grief doesn't make you weak, it makes you exposed. And exposure reveals character, both yours and everyone else's. I started volunteering at the clinic on weekends, helping women navigate paperwork after difficult transitions, divorce, loss, relocation. I didn't tell my story unless it was asked for. Mostly, I listened. There was one woman, younger than me, sitting across the table with her hands folded tightly in her lap. "He says I don't need to know," she whispered, "that it's easier if he handles it." I looked at her and felt the echo of my own past. "Knowing isn't a burden," I said gently. "Being kept in the dark is." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. Walking home that evening, I realized something else. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a caution, a reminder, a small lantern I could hold up for someone else walking through the same fog. The house continued to change with me. I painted the spare room a soft green and turned it into a reading space. I replaced the dining table with one I chose myself, solid wood, slightly imperfect, warm to the touch. I hosted dinners where laughter lingered long after plates were cleared. Sometimes, late at night, I sat on the back steps and thought about what I'd lost, not just my mother, not just my marriage, but the version of myself that believed trust didn't need boundaries. I didn't miss her, I respected her, and I built on what she taught me. On the anniversary of the day my husband moved out, I did something symbolic. I gathered every document related to the legal battle, the copies, the drafts, the notes, and placed them in a box. I didn't shred them, I didn't burn them. I labeled the box, slid it onto the highest shelf in the closet, and closed the door. Not forgotten, just no longer carried. Because life had moved forward. I had moved forward. And here's the truth I want to leave you with, spoken plainly, without drama or softness wrapped around it. People who benefit from your silence will always call your voice disruptive. They will say you're overreacting. They will say it's not the right time. They will say you're being emotional. What they mean is your awareness makes them uncomfortable. That discomfort is not your responsibility. If someone uses your exhaustion, your grief, or your love as an opportunity to take from you, whether it's property, dignity, or voice, that is not partnership. That is theft dressed up as care. And you don't have to scream to stop it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand calmly, ask one clear question, and refuse to be brushed aside. I didn't plan to become that woman. I became her because I had to. And if you're listening right now, wondering whether you're being unreasonable for wanting transparency, respect, or shared ground, let me answer that for you. You're not. You never were. So I'll leave you with this, the same way my mother used to leave me with questions instead of instructions. If someone spoke about your life as if it belonged to them, what would you do next? Take a moment with that, and when you're ready, trust yourself enough to answer it honestly.
There was a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, when I realized I had crossed a line I would never step back over. It happened in a grocery store aisle. I was standing there, staring at 2 brands of tea, debating chamomile versus ginger, when my phone buzzed. A message from my ex-husband. Nothing dramatic, just a simple question about a document he couldn't find. Months earlier, that message would have sent a ripple through my chest. I would have reread it, analyzed the tone, wondered if responding quickly would seem cooperative or desperate. I would have answered immediately, careful and polite, as if one wrong word might reopen an old wound.
This time, I finished choosing my tea first. Then I replied, briefly, clearly, without explanation or apology. And when I slipped my phone back into my pocket, my hands were steady. That was when I knew the hold was gone. Detachment doesn't feel like hatred. It doesn't even feel like forgiveness, at least not the cinematic kind. It feels like neutrality, like standing on the shore, watching a storm move farther out to sea. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, it became mine. I started making decisions without running them through an imaginary committee in my head. I booked a weekend trip on a whim. I rearranged my schedule around my energy instead of obligation. I said no without rehearsing a reason. And something surprising happened. The world didn't collapse. People adjusted, or they didn't, and that told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, my sister visited and paused in the doorway of the living room, looking around slowly. The light was warm, spilling across the floor. Fresh flowers sat on the table. "This place feels different," she said. "It's quieter," I replied. She smiled. "No, it's clearer." That word followed me for weeks. Clarity. Not bitterness, not regret. Clarity. I began to see the past without the haze of self-blame. I stopped asking why I hadn't noticed sooner and started honoring the fact that I noticed at all. Many people live their entire lives inside compromises they never name. I had named mine, and then I'd walked out of it. There were still moments of grief, but they had shaped shape. Instead of sharp pain, they came as soft ache, like pressing on a bruise that was healing. I missed the man I thought I married. I missed the future I once pictured. But I didn't miss the uncertainty. I didn't miss the quiet erasure. I didn't miss shrinking myself to keep the peace. One evening, while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old notebook from years ago. Inside were lists I'd written to keep myself organized, chores, reminders, plans. Tucked between them was a page titled, "Things I'll Do Someday." Travel alone, learn a craft, feel safe asking questions, live in a home that feels like rest. I sat there for a long time, my fingers resting on the page. I was already doing those things. That realization didn't make me proud in a loud way. It made me quiet, grounded, like I had finally arrived somewhere I'd been walking toward without a map. Around that time, someone new entered my life, not as a romance, but as a mirror. A colleague who listened without interrupting, who asked questions without trying to steer the answers, who didn't confuse closeness with control. It reminded me that healthy relationships don't require vigilance. They don't require decoding. They don't require silence as a currency. Trust, I learned, is not proven by endurance. It's proven by openness. And openness goes both ways. I thought often about the women I'd met at the clinic, about the stories they carried quietly, convinced they were alone. I wished I could sit them all down and tell them this: you are not difficult for wanting clarity. You are not disloyal for protecting yourself. You are not dramatic for naming what feels wrong. But I knew each person has to arrive at that truth in their own time. All I could do was keep living mine out loud. The final legal loose ends were tied up without ceremony. No final argument, no dramatic last conversation, just signatures and stamped pages. Closure, it turns out, is administrative. The emotional ending had already happened. On the day everything was officially finished, I went for a long walk instead of celebrating. The sky was overcast, the air cool. Leaves crunched under my shoes. I thought about my mother again, how she used to say that life doesn't test you to punish you, but to show you what you're capable of surviving. I understood that now. Losing her had cracked me open. What followed had taught me discernment. Together, they had reshaped me into someone who trusted her own perception, someone who no longer asked permission to feel safe. That night, I wrote a letter, not to him, but to myself. I thanked the woman I'd been for doing the best she could with what she knew. I promised the woman I was becoming that I would never ignore my instincts again, no matter how inconvenient they seemed. And then I slept, deeply, without tension, without dreams that needed decoding. Here's the truth that took me the longest to accept, and the one I hope reaches whoever needs it. Sometimes the betrayal isn't the worst part. Sometimes it's the moment you realize how much you were willing to tolerate just to keep believing in a version of love that didn't exist anymore. Letting go of that illusion can feel like loss, but it's actually an invitation to build a life where transparency isn't negotiated, where respect is the baseline, where your voice doesn't echo unanswered. I didn't win anything in the way stories usually frame winning. I didn't get revenge. I didn't get an apology that fixed everything. What I got was better. I got myself back, fully, quietly, and without conditions. And if you're standing at the edge of your own realization right now, wondering whether it's worth the upheaval, the discomfort, the uncertainty, hear this clearly. Peace is not found by enduring what diminishes you. It's found by choosing yourself, even when your voice shakes, even when the path forward isn't fully lit. You don't need to rush. You don't need to explain. You don't need permission. Just listen closely to the part of you that's been whispering all along. She knows the way forward.
There are mornings now when I wake up and forget, just for a second, that my life once felt like it was built on shifting ground. I'll lie there listening to the ordinary sounds, the distant hum of traffic, a bird arguing with the sunrise, the soft click of the ceiling fan, and nothing inside me tightens. No quiet inventory of worries, no rehearsed conversations waiting to happen, just breath, steady and unguarded. That kind of peace isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives the way good weather does, slowly, after a long season of storms, until one day you realize you stopped bracing for rain. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry anymore. I tell them the truth. Anger was useful, but it wasn't meant to be permanent. It showed me where the boundary was. Once I honored it, the anger didn't have a job anymore. What surprised me most was how my definition of strength changed. For years, I thought strength looked like endurance, holding things together, swallowing discomfort, staying quiet when speaking up felt risky. Now I know better. Strength is saying, "This doesn't feel right," even when your voice shakes. Strength is walking away without a guarantee of what comes next. Strength is choosing clarity over comfort. I used to believe that love required sacrifice in the form of silence, that if I just tried harder, stayed softer, waited longer, things would resolve themselves. But love that demands your disappearance is not love. It's convenience dressed up as commitment. The house, the one that was in his name, no longer carries that weight for me. It's just a structure now, a chapter I closed. I don't drive past it anymore, not out of avoidance, but because I don't need to. Home, I've learned, is not defined by paperwork or walls. Home is where your nervous system can finally rest. I rebuilt mine slowly, intentionally, with small rituals that reminded me I was safe. Morning tea in silence, fresh sheets on Sundays, leaving the porch light on even when I didn't need it. Those details mattered. They stitched something back together inside me. Every now and then someone reaches out, an old friend, a distant cousin, a woman who heard my story through someone else, and they say, "I'm going through something similar. I don't know what to do." I never tell them what choice to make. I just listen, because the hardest part isn't deciding to leave or stay. It's trusting yourself enough to believe your feelings are valid in the first place. Grief taught me that. Betrayal refined it. Healing confirmed it. I don't pretend the journey was noble every step of the way. There were nights I cried on the kitchen floor, mornings I doubted my resolve, afternoons when loneliness pressed against me like fog. But none of that meant I was wrong. It meant I was human. And humans are not meant to live indefinitely in emotional limbo, waiting for permission to feel secure.
If there's one thing I carry forward now, it's this quiet confidence. I don't need anyone else to confirm what I experience as true. That doesn't make me closed off, it makes me grounded. Love, if it comes again, and I believe it can, will meet me where I stand, not ask me to fold myself smaller to fit into its expectations. Until then, my life is full in ways I never anticipated. Full of calm, full of self-trust, full of moments that don't require explanation. Sometimes late at night, I imagine my mother sitting across from me at the table, hands wrapped around a warm cup, watching me with that knowing look she had. I think she'd say, "You did all right." And that's enough. If you're listening to this story and feeling a knot in your chest, I want you to know something important. Recognition is not weakness. It's the beginning of change. Whether you choose to confront, to leave, or simply to start asking different questions, you are allowed to want a life that doesn't feel like a constant negotiation of your worth. You don't owe silence to anyone who benefits from it. You owe honesty to yourself. So I'll leave you with this, the same way I remind myself on days when doubt tries to creep back in. Pay attention to the moments when your body relaxes. Notice where you don't have to explain yourself. Listen to what peace feels like in your own skin. And then ask yourself, gently, honestly, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have chosen yourself, even if the timing broke your heart? If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or are still living through, you're not alone. Share your thoughts, your questions, your truth. Sometimes speaking it out loud is the first act of freedom. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Would you like me to write the closing audience reflection?
Before I let you go, I want to speak to you, not as a storyteller, not as a voice behind a screen, but as a woman who has sat in silence wondering if she was imagining the hurt. If you've ever been in a room full of people and still felt alone, if you've ever been told, "This is just how things are," when your spirit was quietly saying, "This isn't right," if you've ever swallowed your truth because the timing felt inconvenient to everyone else, I see you. Stories like mine aren't really about houses or paperwork or even betrayal. They're about moments, small, sharp moments when something inside you wakes up and asks for honesty. Sometimes that moment comes gently. Sometimes it comes at the worst possible time. And sometimes, like it did for me, it comes when you're already grieving and vulnerable. But here's what I've learned. Pain doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been strong for too long without being protected. You don't have to make the same choices I did. Your path may look different, but I hope this story reminds you that your feelings are information, not inconveniences. They're telling you where care is missing, where respect is thin, where love needs to be redefined. Healing doesn't always look like a big victory. Sometimes it looks like sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. Sometimes it looks like no longer explaining yourself. Sometimes it looks like choosing quiet over chaos. So I'll ask you, gently, if someone showed you who they really were at your most vulnerable moment, would you ignore it, or would you listen, even if it meant starting over? If this story touched something personal for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter too, and you never know who needs to hear them. And if you want more stories like this, real, honest, slow-burn truths about family, love, and choosing yourself, make sure you're subscribed and supporting the channel. Until next time, take care of your heart.